The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, welcome to today's webinar on what to do during an OSHA inspection. My name is Sasha and I'll be your moderator for today. Before we get started, I just want to give you a brief overview on what today's webinar is going to entail and a short introduction for our speaker. Today's webinar will start with a slideshow presentation by our in-house expert Rick Foote. He'll be discussing a variety of topics, all related to OSHA inspection preparedness. Such topics include plan creation and best practices during an audit. We'll then move into some case studies on OSHA inspection preparedness. There will be an open Q&A at the end of the presentation, so feel free to send us your questions or comments. You can do this by tweeting us at Triumvirate or using the hashtag #OSHA. If you don't have a Twitter, you can ask a question by typing them into your chat pane where it says questions on the right. Today's speaker, Rick Foote, is the Industrial Consulting Services Manager at Triumvirate Environmental. Rick has over 25 years of EH&S experience. He's an OSHA 501 instructor and has spoken at many conferences, including Northern New England Safety and Health Conference and ASSE Regional Conference. He's helped bring numerous organizations into complete OSHA compliance. And with that, let's start our presentation. Over to you, Rick.
Okay, thank you, Sasha. Good afternoon, everybody. So as Sasha mentioned, today we're going to talk about how to best be prepared for an OSHA inspection. As many of you know, OSHA has been very, very busy as of the late. And as you can see on the slides here, OSHA has conducted well over 92,000 inspections, and out of those 92,000 there's been over 188,000 violations. So you can see that almost every OSHA inspection there is findings, and what we want to do today is kind of discuss with you how to better prepare yourselves for that type of an inspection. So with that, as is in most OSHA presentations, I'd like to start off with just reviewing the top 10 violations for the past year, 2013. And, I always say to everybody is think about at your own facility, would you have a potential violation with any of these? Obviously at the top is the hazard communication standard, and we have respiratory protection, which most times findings on that include not doing the annual fit testing, etc. Electrical is another one that's also a national emphasis program, especially with the changes to the electrical regulations and adopting the 70E standard, which is the National Electric Code standard, including arc flash. We have powered industrial trucks, lockout tagout, general machine guarding, again, another electrical, just more on the systems design feature, and also personal protective equipment, fall protection, and then exit routes. Okay, so what I'd like to discuss now is, are you ready for OSHA to knock at your door? If I could see a hand raise from all of you, how many of you would actually be, could raise your hand and say you're ready for OSHA to show up at your door? Most times when I ask that, most people say that we're not ready. So hopefully today will help you prepare a little bit better for that. With anything, preparation is always the key. If you are prepared, you should not worry about OSHA knocking at your door. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about now, is what can we do to prepare for that. One of the first things that we always recommend is to form an actual committee. The committee should consist of numerous different people from your different departments within each of your facilities. I know we have representation from all different types of companies and universities, etc. So I try to summarize here different groups, because each one of them will add some significance to your program. Because as we all know, as EH&S managers, facility managers, purchasing managers, whoever you are, there's other people in your organization that can also help you with some of your OSHA compliance. Because for an example, like your facilities department, OSHA may have questions around your ventilation system. So it's always a good thing to know that is, okay, how does that work? And they'll easily answer your questions for you, or when OSHA has that question, you know who to refer to. So these are just a few people. So the idea here is to set up an Escort Committee, We use the word escort because these are the people that may be involved during the incident, during the inspection, I should say, and you want to have them well prepared in advance. You also want to organize all of your internal resources, and that includes figuring out what are you going to do, how are you going to do it. Especially around the logistics and planning, you should have an idea of, okay, how are we going to take them through the facility? What if they come in for one specific complaint that somebody may have? Because everybody asks that question, how do we get inspected by OSHA? Right? The most common way to get inspected by OSHA is an employee complaint. We all know that all our employees are extremely happy at our facilities, correct? And usually that's usually what will happen is, an employee will have a complaint and then OSHA will come in and look at one specific item. So if that happens, how do you know how you're going to take them around your facility? Are you going to walk them outside? Are you going to walk them direct to the facility? Because if you start showing them around your facility, then they're going to start looking at other things or potentially look at other things in your facility. You also want to talk about who's taking the lead. What are the responsibilities? How about communication systems? How are you going to communicate? Who's going to do that? Who's going to be the lead talker? Who's going to sit in on the opening conference and then the closing conference? These are all the things you want to organize well in advance. If you have a inspection preparedness committee, this will help you to organize and also to facilitate the opening conference. The idea of the opening conference is best served to really show how good you guys are. You want to show them that we're well organized, we're all ready for you, you kind of don't scare us. And that's always a good thing for an inspector. The second thing that the Preparedness Committee can do is work out your schedule with the inspectors, how long they're going to be there. I know of inspections that have gone on for 30 days. So those can be really long. I think you want to know that up front, and this is something you want to work out so that you know who's going to be there, who's not going to be there. You can really set all of that up. You want to coordinate the inspections with the different managers within the group. Each person or each company has their own work shifts or tasks that need to be completed, so you want to set that up also with the inspectors to know, okay, this is what we're going to do and when we're going to do it, because they understand people go on vacation, there's all kinds of other issues that may arise, but you want to already have this planned out and how you're going to address it before the inspectors show up. Obviously, with anything else during the inspections, you want to do daily debriefings. You want to have, again, who's going to be in the room that day, how many people are there, what are you going to talk about, how are you going to talk about it, how are you going to record the information that they talk about, because this is all important, because after the end of that day, you may decide that you want to do some type of cleanup of some of the issues that are found, so the next day you can show them that, hey, we did all of this in advance. Okay. You also want to organize and make sure you can facilitate the closing conference. Who's going to be in there? You always want to have, as high up as possible of people within the organization in there. If it's a president, vice president, dean, whatever the titles are at your facility, it's always good to know, okay, this is how we're going to do it and who we expect to have in that room. The escorts that you have, they all should also be trained, because you want to make sure that the people you have walking around with the inspectors are fully knowledgeable in how to answer questions or how not to answer questions. It's more, I always say, is the how not to answer questions, because as we all know, most inspectors are trying to become very friendly with us, and then, most of us will just kind of start really talking and may slip up and say something that they shouldn't. And this person should understand, or persons should understand, the severity of this, and that saying something incorrectly could be a major issue going along. So you want to make sure that they also know how to intercede when there's questions, leading questions, because we all know that have been through an OSHA inspection is inspectors can lead certain individuals into an answer that they want to make sure that they should try to get an answer. Also, most importantly, is the third bullet here, is to allow the person since they know the language of your facility. As we all know, every company has its own language in what they do and how they do it. So this person would be great to serve to be able to say, okay, well, no, this is what they're trying to say. Because OSHA may say it in a very regulatory speak where most employees may not understand that regulatory speak, so that'll allow them to be able to restate the question to them in a better terms. The last one here is also your escorts will really, if it's a question, a very specific question to a specific task at the facility, they can direct that person, they can direct the inspector to the right person to answer that question instead of just arbitrarily picking anybody that may not know the answer. Really the big thing here is to be prepared, as we said. How are you going to be prepared? The biggest part here is probably the most daunting too, is making sure that all of your written plans and records are up to date at all times. As I've done many, many inspections of facilities, that's probably the number one thing that I find is that plans have been written, but they haven't been touched in 5, 10, 15, 20 years in some cases. That's never a good thing. So you want to know right now, where do you stand? You want to know where all those documents are. Is a lot of inspectors, when they first show up at your facility, you're more than likely going to bring them into a conference room, and then some will ask you for, okay, show me all of your written plans, show me all of your training records, show me your OSHA 300 log, and then they sit and wait. And if they're waiting for a half hour for you to come in, well, that's going to show them that you're probably not very well prepared. So you really want to be able to say, okay, I have this stuff, I'm ready to go, let's do this. And, you know, if you can't produce something in a timely manner, let them know. But that's part of your preparedness committee, would be to know who has those documents. If it's a larger institution, what I always suggest is have a list of who has what documents, and that is something you may even want to share with the inspector, is to say, look, these people are here, this is the people that have these different information. And then they can, so that they can get the information for you, or maybe they're on vacation or something like that, and then therefore you can fill in the inspector. You want to have what we call as a preparedness plan. This is, again, how do we do everything? Put it all in writing. This is not something you're necessarily going to share with the OSHA inspector, but it would be something you will share within your facility so that everybody knows what their roles and responsibilities are and able to be ready. Okay? Your records and documentation review, again, you want to assemble only the materials that are requested by OSHA. Some people like to give people more materials. Some people like to give more materials than are needed. So you want to make sure that you only give them what they request. If they only request your hazard communication standard, just give them that. Don't give them your lockout tagout standard also, because they're going to just sit there and look at that also, and you may have issues in there that you wouldn't have showed them in original. You want to identify a conference room. Do not use your own office for records review. I can honestly say I made that mistake many years ago when I first started. I thought the right thing to do was bring the inspector into my office, and I still recall him saying to me, oh, this is great, you're showing me like 15 years worth of documentation. And I'm like, well, you only asked for 3. He said, yeah, but you showed me all of it. I can look at anything now. So I've always said, no, never do that. He was actually good enough to teach me never to do that again. If they make copies of something also, make sure you make copies of whatever it is. That can come in very handy after the fact, because after OSHA shows up on your site and you get your nice letter back from them that says hopefully you all were in perfect shape, which is highly unlikely, but you know, when they're going to say that they found this violation or that violation, it's great to have the same records that they have, and then you can compare notes and say, no, we shared that with you, that was document whatever. And I always say record all of the documents too that you send to them or that they make copies of. Note it, what date, time, and what was the request for. That way there, again, when you need to understand what was it about, you can go back to it. So what I'd like to do now is kind of talk about the inspection process when they show up at your facility. And The big part here with the inspection, again, is planning, is what are you going to do? Are you going to be like the British are coming throughout your facility? Do you have a system in place? Part of your preparedness plan is saying, okay, we have a system in place, is, to be able to go out and say, okay, we're going to do floor sweeps, and we're going to have people go out and check out our facility to kind of clean up the little bits that they can before the OSHA inspectors actually walk out there. Then when you start looking at your plan, this is where you're going to have the opening conference. Who's going to be the speaker at your opening conference? Do you have a slide presentation on what you do? Also, very importantly, is you really want to go over all of the safety requirements that you have for somebody to enter your facility. I've done numerous inspections where I've seen that companies have very elaborate safety programs, but they forget to tell us about them when we're going in to do the inspection. And at the end of the day, I usually cite them for that, saying, well, you didn't tell me about your safety programs. And they're like, oh, we didn't even think about that. So it's always a good thing to do. Also, make sure you're coordinating your schedule with OSHA. Again, lunch, breaks, whatever it is that you need to, so everybody's on the same page. Okay? You also want to do debriefing, with every party that was inspected. So i.e., after the fact, you want to go back to those different groups, maybe after OSHA leaves, and go back to the people that were spoken to by OSHA and ask them if they have any questions or anything like that regarding the process. So during the opening conference, again, as I said, you really want to make sure you have everybody in there that you should. You want to outline that part that you really want to work with OSHA. You want to show them all the great stuff that you guys do. Don't give them any other information. Don't say, oh, we know we have some issues and, we're working on things. Allow them just to, to direct you into what they want. You really discuss with them how important OSHA compliance is to you and that the safety of your employees. They know they've heard it all before, but again, if it's all part of your process and they see that, that's going to be helpful during the inspection, because the smaller stuff, I don't want to say they'll overlook it, but they'll kind of pass on it a little bit better than if they just think that you're in a horrible place. Make sure you have upper management involved. Again, part of this saying that safety is priority number one, as everybody says. If you don't have higher upper management in the opening conference, sometimes that looks bad also, to say, well, is it really that important? Because you want those types of people there to make sure that they're really showing that this is important. Most importantly, too, is asking them, what is the scope of this inspection? Why are they there? What is the most important thing they're looking for? Is it a multimedia where we're coming in, we're looking at everything, full-blown OSHA inspection, or are you here for a specific task, such as, like today, some of the sorry, I drew a blank there. Some of the national emphasis programs, such as silica or combustible dust or ergonomics or whatever it is, you want to understand, okay, that's what they're looking at, so that when you're carrying them around the facility, that you're taking them to the areas that they're mainly focusing on and not really giving them the general overview of the facility. So once you've figured out what it is that you're doing, you want to make sure you accompany each inspector at all times. Be cooperative with them, but don't offer any other information that they have not requested. Again, I've already mentioned, duplicate all your records. Make sure you take good notes, especially at the end of the day. What I always like to do is go over my notes with everybody and say, okay, this is what I heard. This is what I saw. This is what I understood. Are we both on the same page? If they ask to take pictures, make sure you take pictures. If they take samples of something, make sure you take samples at the same time in the same type of containers. Because, again, you don't want any questions on the other end of this. You want to monitor all of your employee interviews. Again, as we stated earlier with the escorts, is to answer the questions or to direct the questions in the right manner. You want to make sure that you conduct the exit interview for each area, to find out what did they find. If you see them writing a lot of notes, I would be like, okay, can I just ask you what you're writing those notes on? Is it something I should be aware of, or is it just a general information that you're writing down based on the facility? it's always good to know, because you never want to be surprised when the letter comes back. Is that way there you can start planning now and how to correct those issues. Again, your Escort guidelines, these are very, very important, is making sure, especially on the second bullet here, is stay by the inspector's side. Again, I've seen it where I've seen inspectors kind of walk off on their own because somebody's having a conversation with somebody, and they could lead themselves into a dangerous situation because you didn't tell them not to. Or more importantly, they could be in an area where you didn't want them to go, and they went there anyways. Okay? Make sure you take good notes. During and after the interview, ask questions, ask questions. Okay? If you cannot answer a question, make sure you tell the OSHA inspector when you'll get back to them with the answer to a question. Because maybe it's that the person is no longer there, or the person's on vacation or away at a conference, anything like that. You want to make sure that OSHA knows you're not just trying to blow them off on the question, but that you want to get them the answer, but we're just not sure what it is at this moment. Okay. So now that you know you have some issues, or any issues are found, as they're found, if you can, correct them. Any OSHA inspector will tell you, that that's a good thing. It may or may not, it depends on the inspector, it may or may not end up in the final report if it's something minor that you can correct right then and there. I've seen situations where it didn't end up in the final report. They just said, oh, great, you took care of it that day, that's fine. I've also seen other inspections where it ends up in the final report, but it says it was corrected the day they were there. So you really want to try to do as much as you can while they are on site. Also, if you can correct it while they're not on site and they come back the next day, you want to point those out to them. You want to point out to them that, okay, you know what, you brought this issue up, we took care of it last night, can we take you back to it to see it now? And again, hopefully that they will not put that in the report and that it's already taken care of. Also importantly is behind the scenes, kind of, don't look behind the curtain type of aspects, is you want to make sure that everybody knows where the inspectors are throughout the day. Where are they in the facility? So that people are aware. I've seen inspections where companies will shut down an entire department while the inspector's on site. Some inspectors don't like that, because then they're like, well, we can't really see what's going on, but they can't force you not to. I'm not suggesting that that's a good idea. It's just that is what some people do. But you really want to know so that people aren't kind of bouncing around in the areas, or really you want to limit the activities in that area if you can. The closing conference, possibly the most important part of all of this, is the closing conference. This is where you get a real good idea of how did it go. And you see on the slide here that I say, you would like to have, the VP or somebody high up in your facility, and maybe an attorney present. The attorney is really strong, as that's when you know things have really gone bad. If you feel like things are really bad, then you may want to have an attorney present, but it may not be needed. You want to make sure that you can present any documentation that you can of any corrective actions that you did during the inspection. Again, as I mentioned previous slide, that's always a great idea to do it on a daily basis, but it's also at the end of the closing conference here. This is your last chance in order to influence or change the inspector's minds that you've actually done something to correct that issue. If you have answers to any of the questions too, then that you could not answer previously, this is the time that you want to have them answered. And make sure you're very clear and concise with your answers. So kind of some more guidelines here for you on this is to really be thinking about it. Take good notes. I can't stress that enough. I think they say you got to say something 3 times, right, for it to stick in. I think I say take notes more times than that. Don't attempt to deal with hypothetical situations. I have a friend that has this issue. They've heard it all before, or things like that. They don't want to hear it. Okay, fix any simple deficiencies. Again, make copies. Make sure you seek approval, from them to take pictures too. Some companies won't allow pictures to be taken in their facilities, so make sure they know that. Or if they do take them, say, make them sign an agreement that those pictures won't be used for any other purpose. It's your facility. You have to take control. Okay? I always love my first bullet on this one is don't offer an opinion or agree or disagree with the inspectors. The worst thing you want to do is have an argument with an inspector. That's probably not going to go over very well. Okay? I mean, it's good to talk about sports or other things, right? Try to get their minds off of it because we all know the Patriots will win this weekend. I know we have people from other parts of the country, but sorry, I'm a Patriots fan. Okay? Don't be their buddy. That's always a big thing too. Obviously, don't sign anything. You should not be required to sign anything. They're going to have to make sure you do one thing that I know I don't have in the presentation is obviously when they first show up to is ask for credentials. They have to show you their credentials that they are actually OSHA. Okay? Keep them from harm's way. This goes back to, too, is what I stated previously, which was don't allow them to walk off on their own because they may or may not know that they're walking into a high hazard area because it depends on how you walk them through the facility. They're not going to understand everything that goes on there. So it's very, very important that you keep them right next to you. Okay? Don't offer them information too unless you're specifically asked. Don't try to give them more information thinking that it's going to help your cause. Okay? Obviously, don't argue with them. We all complain about the regulations, but they're not going to want to hear that from you. And don't be pushed into giving any answers if you don't know what the answer is. It is okay to tell them, I don't know. I need to talk to somebody else because that's part of their program. Okay? Don't be evasive either. Answer the question directly. Make sure you give them a full answer. And most importantly, do not lie to them. That's going to get you, as we all know, lying is never a good thing. And don't speculate. Again, can't stress it enough. If you don't know an answer to a question, don't answer it, period. It's all part of that preparedness. And again, choosing the people who you're going to have speak to the OSHA inspectors is the most important part of all of this. One of the big things that most people fail on during an OSHA inspection also is training requirements. As most of you know, this could be potentially the most daunting task under OSHA is ensuring that all of your employees are properly trained based on their functions within your facility. You will see on the next few slides here is I have listed out all of the OSHA regulations that require training, and it's daunting. And again, I know some of you these will not apply to, but it's important that you know that each one of these, and I believe Sasha had mentioned that you will get copies of the presentation. You can go to these hyperlinks and it'll take you to the training requirements for each one of these. And unless you have like a matrix, a training matrix, along with a employee description on which ones of these regulations each employee is required to be trained under, this is an easy citation for OSHA to cite. Everybody needs to be trained on some of these, like the first one, emergency action plans. Obviously today, with all of the things that have gone on in the world, we really want to make sure our employees are prepared to get out of our facilities or prepared to do whatever it takes during an emergency. I am not going to go through each one of these individually because we could be here all day with that. But you can see here, again, PPE is a big one there. Personal protective equipment. Have employees been trained on how to don and doff and limitations of your PPE? Have you done job hazard analysis or job safety analysis under the PPE standard, then trained them on it? Do you do annual training on respiratory protection and the annual fit testing? Lockout tagout. Have you trained your authorized employees on lockout tagout procedures? Never mind the other part of lockout tagout, which is verify each one of your lockout tagout procedures on an annual basis. Fire protection, another one. Fire extinguishers. Most companies have fire extinguishers. Are your employees trained to use those properly? Or do you expect them to use them? Then they must be trained in how to use them. A very common one that's found. Depending on what state you're in, now we're getting into some powered industrial trucks. Like for those of you in Massachusetts, you have other pieces to the regulations. Like you got to get a hoisting license. Every state's a little different with that. And then you got again, slings and hoist, and people have been trained on how to inspect the slings and the hoist. If they use them and operate them, you've got to train them on it. You got to document that you trained them on it. Okay? Keep moving on here. We got more. Most of these may not apply to most of you on the call, but electrical. Again, electrical safety awareness. Everybody needs to be trained on that. The proper use of extension cords, plugs, daisy chaining. Still see a lot of daisy chaining out there when I'm doing inspections. I'm sure some of you are saying yes, and if for those of you that are not aware of what a daisy chain is, it's when you're connecting like 2 power strips together, or the most I've ever seen was 5 connected together. So I don't know if any of you out in the audience have seen more than that, but 5's been my limit. That's quite a few of them connected together. Then we get into each one of the specific chemicals that OSHA calls out. And again, if you have any of these, you got to make sure that you're training your people on the exposure to these chemicals. Not to mention a very common one that most people don't train on is the 1910-1020, access to exposure and medical records, a very, very simple regulation that just informs your employees that they have a right to these types of records. There's a big difference between employee exposure records and medical records. I recently had an OSHA inspector ask the client for that, show me how you train your employees. And they had a 1-page document that showed them, okay, this is what we tell our employees. And the OSHA inspector was very pleased and said it was one of the few that he's ever seen. So it is one that you may not hear a lot about, but it's a very simple one. Again, more of these. Then you got hazard communication, our favorite one, right? Everybody's got their training done, right, on the new revised hazard communication standard. And I'm sure that, again, if we saw a raise of hands out there, I would say that there's a lot of you that may not raise your hand on that one. Because, again, recently OSHA has said not everybody has done the training that's supposed to have been done close to a year ago now. So that is an easy one. We saw earlier that under the OSHA top 10 violations, it was still #1. And it was #1 for that purpose is because, again, people don't do the training, their safety data sheets are not up to date, or they haven't revised their program to reflect the global harmonization system. Those of you with laboratories, then you got your chemical hygiene plans. Again, more training. So as you can see here, there's a lot of regulations that require training. And this is an easy or low-hanging fruit, I couldn't spit that one out, low-hanging fruit here that for an OSHA inspector to find. So really what you want to do is make sure that you have all of the training that's required. So just kind of going more on preparedness here is how ready are you? How ready are you for an OSHA inspector to show up at your facility? The best way we can tell you to try to do that is to develop an OSHA compliance calendar. As we all know, the OSHA regulations are quite large, and what you want to do is figure out which of the OSHA regulations are applicable at your facility or not applicable at your facility. What we guide our clients on is to say, well, let's look at every single OSHA requirement and make a decision, is it or is it not applicable at this facility? And let's put that all together in a binder with a calendar to say, when are we going to review each one of those that are required to be reviewed on an annual basis? What this allows you to do is to also have people responsible for it within your company. You may not be responsible for a piece of the program, but at least then somebody else is, and you know that every January you're going to look at your emergency action plan. Every February you're going to look at your hazard communication plan, and et cetera, and et cetera. That way there's at least a timeline that everything will get reviewed, and you know that when something is due. Especially with training, also you want to develop that training matrix. And in order to do the training matrix, it really comes back to, at least in my opinion, is to have your job hazard analysis or job safety analysis, because that's going to tell you what each individual task entails and then what regulations are also connected to that hazard, that job hazard analysis. I know that job hazard analysis is mainly geared around personal protective equipment, but I also like to use it as saying, okay, what other regulations are potentially affected by that job? Is it lockout, tagout, electrical safety, powered industrial trucks, ladder safety, fall protection, whatever it may be. So it's always good to kind of connect the dots with all of that. You want to make sure that all of your written plans are up to date, and do you need them? Like I mentioned earlier, is developing that OSHA binder is in there. Let's just say you don't do any welding, cutting, or brazing at your facility. Well, I always put a tab in a binder that says welding, cutting, and brazing, and if it's not applicable to the facility, say it is not applicable at this time to this facility, but will be reviewed at the next cycle. And in the OSHA compliance calendar, it says, okay, in February, we're going to look to make sure they're not doing welding, cutting, and brazing. And we take care of that. And that way there, I know that each one of the written plans are always up to date. And we make sure that when you're reviewing them, you also match it up to the regulations and say, did something change in the regulations? Because you want to make sure that that's also included in there. As we said earlier, you know, OSHA's consistently been updating and changing programs. I know in my opinion some of them have not been updated as quickly as they should be, or some of them are still pretty antiquated, but it's important that your plans are as up to date as they can be with the regulations. You also want to make sure all your records are organized and ready for inspection. As we stated earlier, part of your preparedness plan should be, again, where is everything located? Are the people still there? Are our emergency contact list up to date? I've seen inspectors where they take out their cell phones today and dial the number that's on a call-in list. And they're going to make sure that person is on the other line. And you don't want to be standing there saying, oh, that person's no longer here. Or like I just recently did an inspection where the checklist hadn't been updated since 2000. So that's quite old. Okay. You also want to review your OSHA 300 log on a regular basis. I know a lot of people, or at least when I speak to a lot of people, they say, oh, that's an HR function. Well, as safety professionals, you should also be using this, because this could be the trigger that brings OSHA into your facility. If you got a lot of injuries, or your TRI number or anything like that, you would need to know that. And then what are those injuries? Are they systemic? Do you keep doing the same injuries over and over again? Well, then that's going to tell you that one of your programs are failing. And maybe you need to update your program or review your program to say, hey, something's not right in here. We need to correct this. Okay? You want to conduct your own internal inspections. Why wait for OSHA to show up? You want to go around and do inspections of your areas. Maybe pick a team of people within your facility and train them on one part of the regulation and have them go around and do inspections. The best part about doing that, though, is usually you have an inspection checklist, and it's people that don't normally do that job, because you want to make sure that if they can figure it out, everybody else can also figure it out. You want to get your employees to buy in to your programs. OSHA has gone from the days, like when I first started in this world, it was like, great, you got a great OSHA binder on the shelf, you got all the written programs in there, that's fantastic. Now OSHA has gone more performance-based, where they go out actually into the field and say, okay, is that program really work? I don't want to say they're less concerned with the written documents, but they actually want to make sure that the programs actually work and that people are actually doing it. So you really want to make sure that your employees are there, and part of the process when you write a written program, make sure that you're accurate in what you're saying, and that you're not just saying, oh yeah, we do this, and then your employees are doing the total opposite of that. You also want to make sure that you're enforcing all of your programs. If you've got employees out there, going back to your OSHA 300 log, there's a lot of eye injuries, but your company says you're going to wear protective eyewear at all times, there's a problem. And OSHA may ask you, well, what kind of disciplinary action have you taken on any employees for not wearing protective eyewear? And you say none. Well, that's not a good representation either of your program. That, again, is saying, okay, you say it, but you don't do it. very similar. If any of you are out there ISO world, it says plan, do, check, act. I'd like to say the same thing for OSHA. It's really, you got to plan it, you got to do it. If nothing happens, you got to act upon it. Okay, so it's kind of that continuous cycle of making sure that you do everything you need to do. Okay, so with that, just real quick here, I want to give you a couple of real life examples here of audits that recently we have done, which is, one of them here is, we did a survey, for a client to help them identify any type of compliance issues that they have and to train any employees on what to do when they arrived. Of course, like most issues, we found numerous issues that needed to be addressed, and I always say most of the issues that we found were because they didn't know what they didn't know. They thought that, wow, we have a great OSHA program and we got all of the major things that are needed. But as some of you may know, there's a lot of little forget it, I can't say the word, but very, minute pieces to the regulations that most people may not be aware of, and that's where someone like ourselves during inspection, we can find something like that, or yourselves, when you're doing these internal audits, that's really what the purpose of them is. Then OSHA did come in. Actually, it was one of the consultation services. They came in several months later, and the facility was found to have no violations in their program, and they were actually commended for what they did and being very proactive in their stances. So it really helped them because they were already ready to go, they were prepared, and everybody was happy at the end of the day. Same thing here, we had a higher education client that had an employee complaint, which I mentioned earlier is a very common thing today, is to have employee complaints. And we, again, assisted the client with responding to the complaint, because if any of you have gotten these, they can be pretty vague in some ways. Like, they don't always tell you what it is, and then you got to try to figure out what are they talking about. Or it might have been an issue at a specific time of the day, and you're trying to reenact what was going on at that point. So in this case here, we went in, we looked at what the issues were, and we helped them correct it. And then we also trained the staff on what to do and what to say when OSHA came back on site, which was, again, how are you going to walk them around the facility? Let's go this way. Well, all right, what's the repercussions of taking them this way? So you kind of walk through with everybody, and again, that preparedness really opened up their eyes to say, ooh, we didn't think of that. But again, if you don't practice and do these things in advance, it's things that you're not going to think about until the actual day that you get that profound knock on the door, which really makes everybody's day, right? When an inspector knocks at your door, you're just saying, what a great day today is. Okay? Most of us aren't that way, okay? Even though we all want to be that way, but I really do think that preparedness is the key, is to go back and ask yourself and say, how ready am I? Because each of us should say, we're pretty ready. None of you out there can probably say that you're 100% compliant with the OSHA regulations. And guess what? Any OSHA inspector will tell you that too. No company is 100% compliant at all times. It's almost impossible, if not impossible. But the better you're prepared and know where you are and know where your weaknesses are, then that's only going to help you during an inspection. So with that, I believe we're going to open it up to questions, correct, Sasha?
Yep, we already have a bunch of questions coming in.
Oh, okay.
Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you fine, Sasha. Yeah.
Great. So the first question coming in is, are there any specific OSHA requirements for a small business?
When you say, the question was around small businesses, is when you say small business, well, OSHA pertains to everybody, okay? And there's a lot of misconception around that because there is a part of the rules that says 10 employees or less, right? But the 10 employees or less is only for certain regulations that says that things don't have to be in writing. As an example, your emergency action plan clearly states that that does not have to be in writing, it can be verbal. But the regulations themselves still apply to them. There is a lot of different entities out there too to help that with small businesses like the consultation service, that's their #1 job, is to help smaller size companies.
Great, thank you. Next question is there a list of potential written plans that we should have? So is there a resource somewhere that would provide them with that information?
I could answer that a little smartly, which is to say, yeah, the OSHA regulations list all of those out. I am not aware of any one specific document that's published by OSHA that lists out all of the written requirements. You know, for the written plan ones, I'm only aware that you go and dig into them. OSHA does have a training one that should list out all of the training requirements.
Okay. Someone wants to know, what about nuclear plants? What jurisdiction does OSHA have over them?
Ooh, over a nuclear plant. That's a great question. Well, I know the NRC rules first, okay, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, definitely, but OSHA is still applicable to them unless the Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulations are more stringent, then OSHA would still be applicable. There is no exceptions.
Okay. Someone wants to know how common inspections at state universities are.
That's always a loaded question. Well, because then it gets into, the question mark becomes, is OSHA applicable to state entities? And again, it depends on the state that you're in, because certain states have their own OSHA, and then the regulations are a little different. So it really would depend on what state you're in, but it's not uncommon, but you definitely hear of it less in a state institution than you would, say, at an industrial or other type of facility.
Okay. Another question is commenting on a piece of advice that you gave. They said one of the pieces of advice you gave was to monitor employee interviews, but in their experience, the OSHA inspector has made them leave the room. Is this something that they are allowed to do? Can they insist on staying?
Yes, they can definitely insist on staying. You have the right at all times, unless it's, unless it was an employee complaint and it was, the employee that, came forward to say that, I was the person that reported it and they wanted to speak confidentially with the inspector, but you have every right. Same thing, even if you're a union facility, is that, the shop steward could also request to be present during any questioning.
Okay. Next question, can OSHA conclude with a closing conference and then contact them again to hold another one?
So I just want to make sure, Sasha, I heard you correctly on that one. You said if OSHA can have a closing conference, then they can they request a second closing conference?
Yes, yep.
I've never heard of that. The only time I've heard of that is, or something similar to that, I should state, is where OSHA needed to go back and research something, to make sure it was actually applicable or not, and then they came back in to review their findings with that, with that company for that specific regulation. So I don't know if that's necessarily considered a second closing conference.
Okay. Next question. If you have multiple locations, should a committee and facilitator be present at every site, or is one committee with the ability to travel between sites sufficient?
I would think that one committee would be sufficient, but it would depend on how far apart are your facilities. If it's a plane ride to get to another facility, then one committee may not be enough, because they may not be able to get there a reasonable amount of time for the inspector. But if they're local, then I would think that yes, one committee would be good. But the value to having separate different types of committees too is you could cross-train them into each facility so that you could use them to do internal audits also.
Great. Someone wants to know what your recommendations are on how to convince management that there is a need to prepare for OSHA.
Oh, that's always a good one. How do we prepare, get management to buy in? Safety is number one, right? Isn't that what they all say? Yeah, I'm just, that always makes me laugh, because it's hard to, that's really, the million-dollar question, as I say, is most times, or at least in my personal experience, convincing management is showing them the value of what a good safety program can bring. And what I mean by that is, no injuries. When you start your workman's comp, payments, once those numbers start going down, the management takes a looks at that and says, oh wow, there is a value to this. And you share with them what the average cost of an injury is. It's well over $20,000 per day, right? Any of that information can sometimes help with management. It's just really, every manager is different when it comes to that, but that's just some of the tools that I've seen used and I personally have used.
Great, good advice. So the next question says, we perform work in both construction and general industry. How do I know when we are in construction or general industry? For an example, fall protection. What does OSHA look at to determine which standard applies?
OSHA will look at what task is being performed at that time, and they're pretty clear between, and that's a great question on the general industry versus construction, is you have to look at the definitions in the OSHA regulations under construction. And even though they're somewhat vague and not clear in some cases, but in other cases it's pretty straightforward. You have people hanging sheetrock, say as an example, or up on the roof doing rigging. Well, that's going to be construction versus somebody up on a roof and they're changing filters in, say, an air handler. That's more of a general industry task. So it's really all task driven, and you would have to look at each individual task and read the definitions under both regulations.
Right.
It's not uncommon though to have companies that are doing both, and it constantly happens, and there's continuous overlap, and people never look at the construction standards.
Okay, thanks. Next question. So you had said earlier that there are no exceptions to OSHA, to companies that fall under OSHA. But this person wants to know, aren't there certain SIC groups that are not included, such as R&D or engineering? They said they had an OSHA inspector leave based on this.
I have never heard of a certain SIC codes not being included under OSHA, personally. The only time I've ever seen or heard of anything is more like somebody working in a home office, at home. That's one I would have to look back at, but I'm not aware of that one, especially not in the R&D. There's definitely no R&D exception.
Okay. Someone wants to know if they're responsible for ensuring that a company who leases space in their building is OSHA compliant.
Dude, it's always one of those questions, huh? Potentially, it's really comes down, OSHA is going to find somebody, okay? And it's typical with most environmental health or safety regulations is any inspector is going to want to know somebody's liable, and what it really comes down to is, well, what does your lease say with them too? And I hate to get into lease or legal terms, but if they're doing work in your facility, then you're potentially liable if you allow them to do something. Or does your lease say that they're leasing the space and that you have zero responsibility for what they do? Then it would be separate that way. But somebody's got to be responsible, and usually it comes down to the only way is a legal definition.
Okay. Someone wants to know if OSHA has the authority to investigate a complaint from a government entity.
In a government entity.
From a government entity.
Yeah, from a government entity. That one I have no experience with. That one I would have to get back to the group on that one.
All right, sounds good. Someone wants to know how often smaller organizations are audited.
There's no real number on that. OSHA, as I stated earlier, OSHA does, thousands of inspections a year, and to say when do they, who gets inspected when, it's all based on, as I previously stated, is your, again, employee complaints, your lost time ratio, how many accidents you've had, is there a death, is it under a, some type of an enforcement action, or, is it just one of the targets that are out there under the OSHA requirements? It's really hard to say, how often any type of company or organization is inspected. It really is, a lot of it is luck of the draw, or unluck of the draw, I should say.
Someone wants to know if you have any words of wisdom in regards to contractor safety policies and OSHA compliance.
Words of wisdom for a contractor safety program?
Yes.
Yes, create one. Really, contractors, as most people are aware, are probably the biggest headache that most companies face. And if you look in the OSHA regulations, it doesn't specifically state that you need to have a contractor safety plan or program specifically. All it states is that you are supposed to relay all of the known hazards to those contractors. But what I always say on that is if you develop a written contractor safety program which details out all of your facility safety requirements and then what is expected of them, and prove to you that they've actually had the trainings or whatever it is that they're doing for you, say it's permitted confined space entry, is actually have them prove to you that they have had training and a copy of their written program and all of that. That's only going to help you to feel better about what they're doing. And if, God forbid, something does happen at your site, you can say to yourself, hey, I at least did my due diligence, and maybe this was just a true accident.
All right. We are starting to run out of time, so I'm only going to take 2 or 3 more questions. Just so everybody knows, though, we are going to send out a Q&A transcribed copy after the webinar. So we'll try to answer all the questions that haven't been answered yet in that transcribed copy. So your question will get answered. So 2 more questions we're going to answer on the webinar. Have you heard of OSHA issuing a citation for a company not meeting the new voluntary PELs for hazardous chemicals?
None yet that I'm aware of.
Quick answer. Maybe we can do 4 questions.
Yeah, no, that was pretty straightforward.
So someone wants to know if quality OSHA compliance can lower company insurance rates.
I have heard that, and yes, you would have to check with your insurance companies, because some insurance companies do actually offer, discounts for voluntary compliance, such as like the SHOP program or the VPP program or anything like that. A lot of your insurance companies will give you that information, give you that, a deduction in your rates based on that. So yes.
Okay. Someone wants to know if the union representative has to be invited to the opening conference. When they invite themselves, can we ask them to leave?
That you're getting in now, that would be part of your, again, part of your contract with the union. What does that state? I've seen it go both ways, where the union, it says that the union will be involved with all operations or, safety programs within the facility, or, if it's not going to involve the employee interviews, then they may not need to be in the opening conference. So you really have to go back to what is your agreement with your particular union state.
Okay, thank you. So it looks like we're out of time. Thank you all for all your questions, but we'll be concluding the webinar now. We'll send you all an email with a copy of the presentation along with a recording sometime later today. The email will also have a link to a survey asking you to rate this webinar. If you could please fill it out, that would be very helpful to our team at Triumvirate. We have several upcoming webinars, including one on how to minimize your waste for industrial organizations, waste stream analysis, and best tactics for healthcare institutions, and preventing liability with lab decommissioning. You can find these webinars on our events page at www.triumvirate.com/training/events. Also, for those of you in the New York area, Rick will be speaking there on December 10th. We'll send you all an email sometime later this week. It's going to be a more in-depth OSHA inspection preparation roundtable. We'd love to have you all there. Thanks again for attending, and we hope to see you next time. Bye!